and seek agreement that agenda items 4, 5 and 7 recorded by Hansard.
Great.
This is the first meeting for a new member, Mr. Marcin. You're very welcome, Marcin.
Thank you.
Can I also say that selfies are forbidden in the committee?
Okay.
For the record. You're not in Belfast City Council.
Can I advise members that in line with procedure the committee can note any relevant extract from the register of interest when available, and can I also acknowledge the contribution of Raymond McCartney, who was on the committee for a very lengthy period of time, 2 weeks. So we acknowledge that. Apologies received from Judith and Dominic. Any other apologies?
It's a punishment, you know.
No. Can refer members draft minutes pages 5 to 9. Members content their accurate record.
Great.
Refer members table requests for noting pages 11 to 14. Can I also advise members the Department will be due to provide its formal written response to the Flexible Working Inquiry report that was before the committee earlier this week, and that is to be provided in 8 weeks, and then the committee can decide on how it might continue to pursue the recommendations contained therein. Moving on to the first session then, I can refer members to the departmental briefing paper, pages 4 to 20 of your table pack, and the Secretariat's preparation paper.
Good to see you, David.
Okay, can I welcome David Sterling, Permanent Secretary to the committee. This is your first time here, David, isn't it?
I was here with the Minister
Yes.
about a month ago.
You're very quiet that day, weren't you? So you're front and centre today. Can I also welcome Bridget Worth and Catherine Hill to the committee again. David, we're just going to go straight to questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
And go from there.
Can I just say one thing? And firstly, it's just, and I regret that on my second appearance here I'm starting with an apology, but I do want to offer an apology for the late submission of the return on this. We have been all consumed by budget issues in recent times, but you know, I will make sure that we do better the next time.
Just on that point, and since you raise it, I'll address it. The paper wasn't received until 11:41 a.m. yesterday. Could you talk us through why it was so late?
Well, I don't think it's particularly helpful to go into all the processes we go through, but I think it's just to say that
just 3 or 4 I want to look at.
we have been, as I say, all consumed by dealing with budget issues in recent times, and it has taken us longer to get it to you than we should have done, and we will do better the next time.
When did the departmental board consider the AFP's performance in this regard?
The board would have reviewed performance at its last meeting, which was the last
October 27th.
Yeah, October the 27th. Yeah.
And what assurances can you give us that the needs of the committee are respected and the papers are received? Because this isn't the first time it's happened, to be frank.
No, as I say, I will make sure that we do get papers to you on time in future.
Moving on to questions. A number of the cross-cutting targets in the business plan are 101, 02, 08 and 09. Make reference to matters being outside the control of DFP officials. Has there been any consideration given to whether such targets should be reframed to focus on supporting actions that are actually within the department's control?
Some of our targets are also ministerial, they're also programme for government commitments. The most significant targets, for example, e.g. the one on corporation tax. And I think the desire of the executive was that for programme for government commitments, there should be one person, one person or one department identified as the senior responsible officer. And I think that improves accountability. But it does mean that there are difficulties whenever more than one department is involved in the delivery of a target. So that is just one of the issues that we wrestle with. But certainly where there are any cross-departmental targets, we do work hard to try and make sure that there is good cooperation between the various departments that are involved in the delivery of that particular target.
Just in regard to target R101, to agree department spending plans for 15-16 financial year by the 31st of March 2015. What is your current assessment of that target, given the fact that the executive has agreed the draft budget? And what other risks do you see arising from that, such as workforce restructuring is one of the things that's been referred to from the department?
Sure. Well, I think one of our concerns was that the executive mightn't have been able to agree a draft budget. Thankfully, one has now been agreed. Now, it is one that poses major challenges for our department and indeed for all departments, which you will be aware of. But we now have a timetable which will see the consultation conclude on the 29th of December. And we will let, ministers will then obviously have to consider what they hear in that consultation. My minister will be having a series of bilateral meetings with all his ministerial colleagues over the next few weeks. And on the foot of those discussions, obviously, my minister will want to bring some proposals for the final budget to the executive as early as possible in January. Now, on the assumption that the executive agrees a final budget, then that will give certainty to departments about their spending plans for next year. But obviously the budget does, the draft budget certainly includes very stretching targets for departments in terms of managing cuts to current expenditure. So that is going to be a big issue for us all.
And what's the main risks in terms of the next financial year? What's your main concerns? Because obviously, in terms of the financial year just passed, health overspent, and of course health is obviously under pressure again this year. So what's the big challenges for next year?
Well, the big challenges will simply be delivering the scale of cuts which have been set out in the draft budget, and we have to assume that the final budget will be not that different from the draft, given that there's unlikely to be any new spending power come on the table or any significant spending power come on the table. So the big risk is that this is unprecedented in my view. I've more than 35 years experience in the public service, and I can't recall a time where any department had to deliver this scale of cuts. And you mentioned, Chair, for example, managing pay bill, managing workforce planning issues. Those are going to be central to delivering a lot of this, and we are at the moment working with other departments on how we will go about ensuring that there's a coordinated approach to this.
What consideration have you had of revenue raising, trying to offset some of the pressures that we are facing?
Well, obviously, as officials, our job is to provide ministers with a variety of options, and ministers had a variety of different things to consider when they were drawing up the draft budget, and we will continue to provide such advice as we feel is appropriate in the circumstances.
Okay, Leslie.
Thanks, Chair. 102, obviously, I guess the most difficult one at this point in time, covering expenditure to the year end. Several sort of points, David, about that. First of all, I think one of the things that surprised me most was that no real dangers were flagged up in this issue until after the June monitoring round. Is that right?
No real dangers, and sorry.
No real crisis had been identified prior to the June monitoring round.
In terms of pressure on public services or on public expenditure?
Yeah, whole budget.
I only joined the department at the beginning of July. Now, I'm not using that as an excuse in this regard, but I certainly my perception when I was Permanent Secretary and Deputy was that there was definitely going to be a very severe squeeze on public expenditure, and I think this was widely known around the system.
Well, we've just maybe explored some of the individual ones. You take there are several cases, but one that sticks in my mind, the victims unit. There was no budget for it, in fact, at the beginning of the year. It was envisaged to be dealt with in the June monitoring round. And there was a delay in that, as you know, and in the October monitoring round, I think I'm correct, suddenly it appears as an inescapable pressure Can you explain the logic of that, where it doesn't appear in the main budget and then suddenly appears in year as an inescapable pressure?
I'm not aware of the history to that particular issue. But what I would say generally is that when we are preparing advice on a draft budget or on a monitoring round, we will seek to advise ministers of all emerging and new pressures. And we would certainly want in any draft budget to make sure that any pressure that's known about is brought to ministers' attention. So, as I say, I can't comment on that particular issue.
Then that's an easy one, because it was there the year before and the year before that. In fact, staff and all are involved in it, but it didn't appear in the actual budget. The intention was to deal with it in a monitoring round. And then suddenly, they're just picking up the issue here that suddenly becomes an inescapable pressure, mid-year, which leaves you very little time, to do anything about it. What's the logic of that?
Well, certainly, from time to time, pressures do emerge, but and indeed, on occasion, ministers have decided in the past that because of constraints on public expenditure, that they will use money freed up in year in monitoring rounds to meet particular pressures that are known. Now, I can't comment on the particular victims issue because I'm not aware of it, but I know certainly that structural maintenance for DRD has been funded in the past by monies that have become available in year, and that has been an accepted practice over a couple of years, though we have sought to address that in baseline. So there are a variety of ways in which different types of pressures are addressed.
And there's probably a DFP example as well. I think you've touched on earlier sessions around the non-domestic revaluation of rates, because the decision to do that was taken after the 4-year budget was set. That has had to be dealt with as from reduced requirements emerging within the department during subsequent financial years. So there's something there in the fact that the opening budget for any given year, particularly for 14-15, where the opening budget was set back in 2010-11, there will have been things that have arisen since that initial budget was set that were not anticipated at the time the budget was set, and therefore you enter any given financial year with a pressure that needs to be managed in year.
Yeah, but you should know, I don't want to lay out the point, but you'll be aware of that at the start of the budget year when you're knocking what I call the budget, because I don't subscribe to 4-year budgets. The short-term, medium-term plans, that should be an annual budget. But at the beginning of the year that that's an existing cost centre, and therefore it should appear in the budget. Is there anything you've learned from that exercise, or is there anything that you're going to change?
Well, the draft budget has sought to address some pressures weren't in departmental baselines. So, we always want to make sure that people aren't reliant on monies that become available in monitoring rounds where that is possible to do so. And, indeed, in the draft budget, we have done that in a number of areas.
Would you think the other departments have learned that then as well, David?
Well, I think
telling them that?
Yeah, finance directors and accounting officers will be alive to these issues, and we do have good engagement with finance directors across departments and with accounting officers.
There weren't no FMD,
including...
Anyway, I'll leave it there, Chair. Thanks.
Peter?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, David. I want to just touch on one aspect, I suppose maybe close to a lot of our hearts in terms of the ongoing issues always been in terms of the LPS situation, which in terms of, not surprisingly, obviously given the problems in terms of debt, given the sort of situation we're in at present, and obviously at target sort of 111, there's a sort of a target, if you like, to reduce the amount of rate debt by about 4 million or 5% by 2015. I wonder just if you maybe clarify a couple of things just in terms of the total value of the actionable rate debt, because obviously what is actionable and what is there, obviously two different things in that regard. And sort of what's your strategy actually to pursue that in terms of providing that extra impetus in that regard? Because clearly if you're targeting where you see the potential quick gains in that regard, and what scope is there to push the target sort of further in that regard? Well, appreciating simply if you just have a paper target, which quite frankly if you're going to be pursuing people which there's no money there, and it simply becomes just an exercise which actually costs money but doesn't realise anything in. So I wonder if you could just talk us through that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, you've actually you've touched on something which had been recognised in the department, both within LPS and by our minister as well, and that was a sense that rather than just setting a very broad target about reducing debt, better to have a more focused target on tackling the debt that you had a realistic chance of recovery. And I know the Minister pressed LPS very hard to set a target that was very stretching. And he's taken a keen interest in ensuring that the target is met. So far, it was a little behind earlier in the year, but we're still pretty confident that we will achieve it by the end of the year. But the intention behind the way the target is structured at the moment is that we focus very much on those who are in debt, but who have a possibility of repaying that debt.
And presumably is LPS's level of intelligence, probably in every sense of the word, sufficient to be able to do that? I mean, because it seems to be what you're saying is the main strategy is a much more drilled down focus. But consequently, therefore, hopefully a better result rather than any other specific sort of action.
That'll be right. There'd be... I can get you more information on the range of measures that are actually applied.
Okay, I think that would be helpful.
Which I don't have just to hand now, but certainly we have been very focused. The department has been very focused on reducing the level of debt in recent years, and this more targeted approach is actually proving to be delivering results. But as I say, I will get you some information about the specific measures that LPS are taking.
Martin, you want to come on that point?
I just wanted to come on that. I mean, it'd be really helpful, Chair, if we get a one-page or two-page update on LPS. I hear people point to it as the panacea, that there's money there that we're not collecting, and I know that has been the experience we have dealt with in the council and the levels of debt. But is it possible to get maybe obviously that information you're providing? But
I mean, I suppose I like to that, to pick up on that point. I mean, there's both, if you like, the issue of the debt side of it, and then I suppose linked in with that, in terms of an LPS, is maybe in the past, I'm not making a judgment call where we are present on, but in terms of non-identification of money that is out there, in terms of things like people not coming quickly enough onto that. And I know, for example, a number of years ago, LPS did an exercise where a number of the councils, I think Belfast and one in North Down was certainly, were effectively, taken down almost to nuts and bolts. They essentially, an LPS officer and a council officer walked around certain areas and, that house has clearly been occupied, it's not on the list, and, did specific levels of targeting, because clearly if people are avoiding the rates bit because they feel under no particular pressure to declare themselves in that regard, there are also issues around how quickly we can identify and get properties that should be paying rates onto the register in that regard. So if whatever information you're getting on the LPS side of it brought back to the committee in terms of a written form, I think that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, we could do that, and certainly if we'll get you a written briefing which addresses that particular issue as well. And certainly in my days in Detty, I would have been aware of Council's concerns about levels of rate collection as well. So we can deal with that, and indeed, if you wish, we can arrange for an oral briefing as well on the back of that at some stage.
Okay. Michaela?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, David. Fraudulent slip.
Don't even have a brother called Peter.
You look like a Peter. Just in relation to the sickness absence, which is, I suppose, is still very much in the media, and only quite recently we had the very high-profile story on the BSNI sickness levels. Maybe if you could just give us some information on where this sits, where the recovery strategy is at the minute, and what are we going to be learning out of the recovery strategy, and what specific actions are in it? Okay.
I don't have the full details of everything that's in the recovery strategy with me, and it is with the Minister, and it does propose a range of measures, including some which would look at perhaps adjusting existing terms and conditions of service. But certainly we're clearly seized of the importance of tackling this particular problem. I'm pleased to report that DFP's own performance is pretty good, and we are hopefully on target to meet our own in-year target. Though I think there has been a sort of evidence of an increase in sickness levels across the Northern Ireland Civil Service. But we do have a blend of measures, everything from through our WELL programme, which will help people who are ill to get back to work, encouraging people to look after themselves. We have a very good occupational health service. We have a good range of measures in place which are helping to address this, but I accept that more needs to be done, and that was why the recovery strategy has been prepared.
Just, you said it's with the Minister at the minute. Are we likely to hear any time soon of timeline in relation to the improvements that could well happen?
Yes, I'll be speaking to the Minister about this shortly.
Just following on, Chair, if you let me, we had the flexible working pattern debate in the Chamber
Yes.
the other day. Do you think if that was implemented, it would certainly help some of the issues? I mean, one of the big issues that came out of that was the stress-related illnesses that present people, and would that have an effect in terms of the sickness level absence, if you think the flexible working pattern kind of was implemented and what the way it committee would?
Well, we've done quite a bit of work on looking at the causes of the stress levels that lead to absence. And I think we've found that a lot of that, some stress is work-related, but quite a lot of it is actually not work-related. We do now have a practice where if somebody indicates that they're off because of stress issues, whether it's work-related or otherwise, that we have instant referral to the Occupational Health Service. And I think that's an important new measure, which we hope will make a difference. But certainly we have, as an employer, I think we can look with some pride at the facilities, through flexible working, through various forms of part-time working, which help people in different scenarios to provide a good level of service and yet at the same time address their own particular personal circumstances. I think even the committee has recognised that we're exemplary in that regard. And we will continue to do that, but we always, of course, need to strike a balance between flexibility for the individual and recognising there's a management need as well. And getting those two things balanced, I think there's always a certain tension between the two things, and it's something we'll continually look at.
Okay, thank you, David. Thanks, Chair.
Just on that point, David, we all know you're flying when it comes to flexi time, but in terms of flexi allocation, there's a fierce resistance within the department. It goes back to previous sessions we've had over the past couple of years. Why is that? Because you look at departments across the water, you look at some of the English councils, you look at BT in the private sector, and there's big benefits to be had here. So why is there such resistance within the department to this?
I actually haven't detected that resistance. It may just be the language we use around this, because when I've read the report that the committee produced, and we're actually doing an awful lot of the things that you suggested we should be doing.
Not a lot.
Sorry?
Not a lot.
I don't want to reopen the debates that occurred the other day.
Why do you?
But I think we bear good comparison with a lot of organisations, both in the public and the private sector. But there are things we can do. There are more things we can be doing. There are more things that we are doing, which will encourage flexibility. Personally, I think we need to make optimum use of technology. Technology now can allow people to work virtually anywhere in the world, and I think working with ESS, we're looking at ways in which we can promote that better. So I'm not anti-flexible working at all. In fact, I'm very for it. But there are different aspects within what you might define as flexible working that, as I say, just need to make sure we get the right balance between the needs of the individual and the needs of the organisation.
In terms of monitoring, I mean, one of the problems we had was receiving statistics from the department and detailed information about what is happening in terms of flexible
Yep.
location in particular. And what we have received seems very patchy, very ad hoc. And of course, this is all in the report. So is there any plans to try and give a more transparent view of what is happening in terms of this?
Yeah, well, I think we will be, like on the back of your report, we will be seeking to make sure that we've got good, consistent data which shows what's happening across all departments.
Okay. Paul?
Okay, I appreciate we're focusing on primarily flexible working, and that links into my question is to do with sickness within the Department of Finance, and appreciate that the rationale, where does the rationale of the 7.6 days come from? Whenever the target previously, and we're not going that long far back, whenever 2011, 12, 13, it was sitting at 10.6, and we're now setting a target of 7.6, and I'm just wondering, how did you come around to the figure of that now? And I'm coming from the private sector, still running a business, and if I was getting 7.6 sickness days to my employees, I would not be very happy. I can hit around about 1.5, and that seems to be quite the norm in the private sector. Appreciate, and I want to know. There is a mention in your report about an e-learning approach for management. I'm just wondering what is meant by this e-learning. I'll just give you the right term that you use here. E-learning sickness absent training for all staff. Now, I would just like to know, is that just a different way of maybe putting it on the system where it doesn't actually register as sick days, but it's down as something else?
No. The e-learning package is a good package, and it was one of the things we concluded across the service was that we needed to remind and instruct all managers and indeed all staff about the rules and the procedures around sickness, and we developed an e-learning package, in other words, a short video, if you like, which people could access at their desk with a questionnaire at the end. So in a sense, not only do you sort of sit and watch, but you have to fill in a questionnaire at the end which demonstrates whether you've actually understood the messages within the e-learning package. And it has actually worked very well. And it's actually quite an efficient way of getting key message to all staff, because you think the alternative is you take people away from their desk and you give them a training program, which can be quite costly. This has proved to be quite a cost-effective way of making sure that core messages are sent to all staff. And it's measurable as well. You know exactly who has done the package. You can check whether they've actually filled in the questionnaire at the end, and you get feedback in that regard. But going back to the target level, certainly, not personally, but I know work has been done to compare the way in which we do things with the private sector, and certainly there are different approaches taken. Our big problem in the public sector is the level of long-term sick. Around 70% of all our absence is people who are in long-term sick. And by its very nature, anybody who's in long-term sick has been certified by a doctor as being sick. So, there's no question as to whether they are or not sick. And we have, as I say, we have a range of interventions which can help in those regards. Certainly the Occupational Health Service is there to assist us in dealing with people who are on long-term sick. And we do have ways in which we can have phased returns, so that people who have been off sick for a long time, for whatever reason, we can encourage them back to work on a sort of phased basis. So we've got, as I say, approaches to deal with this, but our big problem is definitely the number of people who are on long-term sick. And to make significant inroads into our overall levels of sickness, something will need to be done which tries to get down that level.
Just on that point, and it's something I want to, it's just how it's recorded, and having dealt with some individuals who come and said, look, I took off work on a certain day, I wasn't well, thought I was feeling better, went back, and went back for 2 days, and then ended up having to take off a week. And then they're pulled in about their timekeeping, because basically, you know, they've had two sickness incidents, even though one of them was it was only one really, but at the end of the day they attempted to try and come back to work, and some of those people feel that they're being penalised because of an effort to try and come back. So as a consequence of that, it drives them down the route of saying, well, rather than taking off 2 or 3 days, I'm just going to take off the full week just to be sure. So as a consequence, they're taking more time. Because of the policy that is implemented by management and in the way that it's been put forward. So that's that. I'm just wondering, is there any recognition of that being a problem? Because I hear it as a problem, and I'm sure others sitting around the table hear it.
I wasn't aware it's a problem, and certainly if there are examples of that, you know, certainly bring them to our attention. But I suppose line managers need to be careful. You know, the rule is that if somebody goes off sick, they should phone in and they should speak to their line manager. They shouldn't leave a message that they're off sick with anybody else. They should speak to the line manager, so the line manager has a clear understanding of what the nature of the illness is and how long the person feels they may be off. But in the short term, it's not appropriate for a line manager to chase up an individual, you know, if it's only over a few days. But certainly our procedures are very much designed to encourage people to come back when they feel ready to come back, or to come back on a phased basis if they're not ready to come back full time. So, as I say, I would be disappointed if there are occasions where that isn't working, and I'd be happy to deal with any individual instances of that.
I appreciate it might not necessarily be DFP, it could be other departments. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Martin? Thank you, Chair. Dave, it's not bad. You come in this morning and had to start with an apology, so it's always good to have you on the back foot. Despite that, I think you're doing sterling work. But C108, and we're going to talk about an area that you're doing well in. You tell us, which is new methodologies for improving services and stimulating innovation. Yep. And I wanted just to talk us through that, because you have it as a green. You have certainly the right words. We have an ideas engine and an innovation lab. Always a good start to get the correct titles. But I suppose where the rubber hits the road is, off these ideas, what will improve our services and of course save us money as well. You talk here about having 100 ideas have come through, you're going to start implementation, but did you want 10 ideas? Did you want 1,000 ideas? How many ideas is the correct number? Is it quality or is it quantity? So maybe you could talk us through. It seems to me like it's a sort of issue and performance review which is always going to come through as a green, because it doesn't really tell us what success looks like other than numbers. So maybe you can help us with that.
Sure. Well, the Minister is a very strong advocate of public sector reform, and indeed the new Public Sector Reform Division has been set up to help sort of take forward that agenda. And there are a number of things that we're doing. At a very strategic level, the OECD is being commissioned to do a number of benchmarking studies, and I'm pleased to say that all necessary steps to allow that to start have now been concluded, and that will be kicking off shortly. And OECD will be issuing questionnaires around departments, which will allow them to provide benchmark or information which will show how different aspects of our public sector do compared with international comparisons. And this is the first time the OECD will have been doing anything at a sort of regional level rather than at the full national level. So that work will take place over the next year. But obviously at a lower level, the innovation labs, these have been tried elsewhere and have shown good success. So far we have run one successfully, which actually dealt with an issue being addressed by my old department, DETI, and that was to look at how we could apply regulatory impact assessments better. Now, regulatory impact assessments are what we're required to do any time we develop a new policy, and it's designed to test whether there's going to be any negative impact on businesses by having new regulations. And that Innovation Lab has come up with some very good ideas, which DFP and DETI will be working on to implement. And there are other areas where we'll be looking at labs, and you've got the dementia, that should be innovative procurement, not initiative procurement, and big data. And again, in each of those three areas, there are huge opportunities to improve the quality of service. I'm a big believer that we could do much more with innovative procurement, using things like the Small Business Research Initiative to find better solutions to public sector problems and to provide opportunities for our SMEs to win government business. Big data, again, releasing data that government owns to allow companies and others, universities, academia, to use that data to come up with ideas to improve services and develop a commercial project is good as well. But those are just three of the current ideas. I suppose, I wouldn't say the budget has overtaken this work, but the budget has given a much sharper focus to this work. And like for example, in DFP, where we're having to find cuts of 10.9% next year, we have actually extended this ideas process. And we've really got the whole department at the moment working on an internal review where I've just asked people at all levels of the organisation to come forward with ideas. And we've had a number of workshops. And at the last count, I think we had 350, 360 ideas, which will help us reduce costs next year. And obviously we'll need to work through that over the next 2 or 3 weeks to come up with a sort of shorter list of practical things that we can do. But I'm very strongly of the view that this needs to be sort of bottom up and top down, because all our staff have good ideas. Some of them may not yield big savings, but anything that can produce improvements in service or reduce cost by a bit, we need to capture at the moment. So this is only the start. This is something I want to sort of embed in the culture of the organisation and indeed across all departments.
Okay, well, just to finish, if obviously you're asking staff for ideas, but is there a way to involve the public in this work at all? You're also involving the MLAs in this work now because you're listening to what we're saying, but is there a way in some of these to allow the public to look at how government does work and say, well, we have an idea for the Ideas Lab, or the Ideas Engine or the Innovation Lab as well?
Well, the Innovation Labs they're not just civil servants, and indeed the Better Regulation one had a number of people from business and more widely, and indeed in all these other areas would be wanting to draw people in. But on a general point, I think we need to look and see are there ways that we can actually get ideas from all sources at the moment, just given the level of challenge we have. We will be doing a number of consultation events on the draft budget. We don't have a lot of time to do it, but I think we need whatever ideas can come forward.
Thank you.
Is it?
Certainly plenty of ideas from the public. I don't know whether they'll be all helpful or not.
Listen to someone Nolan this morning, and
9,000 square metres of workspace. Can you tell me what percentage of DFP office accommodation would comply with all the relevant standards at this point in time?
I couldn't tell you that off the top of my head, but well, we say relevant standards. We wouldn't have people working in accommodation that wasn't fit for purpose. But
you have an example there, David, workplace Northern Ireland standards, including space utilisation targets.
Yeah, we have. There are space utilisation targets. And one of the things we know is that we probably have, we occupy a lot more space than is optimal. And certainly you look across to Whitehall now, and they are now talking about standards. I think it's 8 square metres per person. Now, I think the target we're talking about would be a bit more than that. But certainly we do need to reduce the amount of space that we currently occupy. We have targets in year. We expect to meet our targets for 14-15. one of the ways in which we to improve in this area going forward, obviously, is we've removed the delegated authority that departments have to enter into new leases, because we're working on a programme of exiting leases where it is cost effective to do so. That obviously produces recurrent savings. We use capital expenditure then obviously to buy premises. Those premises, the intention is to fit out with lower space utilisation per person, and in that way produce savings. So that in a nutshell, is the sort of the strategy that we're following at the moment.
I'm interested in seeing how this fits into flexible working. It's all part of a magic thing. But when was Lanyon Plaza finished, and what kind of financial savings do you anticipate from that?
LPS staff started entering Lanyon Plaza about August time, I think, July, August time. Was it?
It might be a bit earlier than that.
It might be a bit earlier than
They had
that.
a phased
Yeah.
period over a number of months.
Yeah.
Are they all in now then?
I think they're
Yes.
pretty much all in now, yeah. I don't have details of the business case with me today, but certainly we can provide that.
I'd be particularly interested in the financial savings that are expected from
Yeah.
that, because obviously
The financial savings are important, but equally important, I think, is the fact that co-locating people in open plan environment does, in my view, improve management and does create. And I say that as somebody who's now working in an open plan environment. No, I think open plan works well.
I'm sorry you said that there, David, because one of the exciting visits we get here, we got down to Clare House one time to see the open plan system there, and there was virtually nobody there.
That was in the interim period, I think.
Flexible working day.
I think if you were to go there on a typical day now, you'd find it full.
Yeah. But certainly there have been more people have moved in recently. Certainly,
There was a period of time where people had moved out and they were preparing to move people in when it was much more empty than it is now.
Could you pick up that seriously, that
the Lanyon
financial
Plaza point.
savings that are forecast from that, because that would be useful to have obviously within the business plan?
Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of target IP 101, it's down as an amber. Whereabouts are we with that now, post-October monitoring? And is there any further inescapables emerging before the end of the financial year?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll let Bridget take that one.
Now you'll have to refresh my mind as to exactly what the question was, sorry.
Just in terms of the, this was drafted before October
Yes.
monitoring, but now October monitoring has been
Yes.
agreed.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
How much pressure is the department under any further inescapables emerging for year end too?
And certainly the bid that we had met in October monitoring has significantly alleviated our financial pressure, and so I am no longer concerned that we'll overspend this year. At the moment, we're looking at our January monitoring position, and we're seeing what we may be able to do in terms of contributing to the central pressure that still remains. Certainly the fact that the pay rise impact has come in lower than our forecast, and we've also had a number of business areas across the department who are reporting increased levels of forecast income from where they thought they would be. So I'm actually expecting that we will have perhaps something to contribute, as I say, to that central pressure, but it's very early days in sorting out our January monitoring position at the moment, and we'll be back here in a month's time to give you a more detailed position.
And in terms of this target for 15-16, how confident are you at this early stage that you'll meet it?
I certainly wouldn't be rating it any lower than amber in terms of risk, and I would say it will be borderline red. It will be very challenging for us to achieve.
4.4% in year is going to be difficult. So 10.9% is a completely different order of magnitude.
And what options are you looking at the moment?
Well, let's say we've several hundred ideas. Obviously, we're going to have to. We will only deliver this through a sort of a package of measures, and that'll include cutting back on discretionary spend where it's possible to do so. But it'll also mean tackling workforce issues as well.
Just, I suppose, in a cross-departmental issue, we've seen another media report this week about hospitality and overseas trips. How much money could be saved across the whole public sector by looking at that area in particular in terms of hospitality, travel, and things like that? There is there a possibility that could relieve some of the pressure?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what's total spend on hospitality across the public sector. I know there have been AQs about this in recent times. Measured against the executive's $1 billion, it wouldn't be that significant. And certainly, I know that our own spend on hospitality is pretty small.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a target over the last number of years where we've been going through budget reductions. We've really focused on driving down some of those areas of spend, and the board gets regular reports on things like what we're spending on travel and hospitality and things like that. So, we've taken, for example, our hospitality figure has reduced by a quarter since 2007-8. It's down to around £50,000 across the whole department now, and we're holding it to that level, and the board monitors that on a quarterly basis to make sure that it's not exceeded. So, we're looking everywhere for savings, but I suspect we've already taken the bulk of what can be done out of driving some of those things down over the last budget period.
Okay, Paul?
Thank you. I want to move on to OP1.03. That's really looking for an update on the business underperforming, those that are to fill in their personal performance agreements and areas like that, and what measures are being taken to make sure that it comes back on track.
Yeah, we've put a lot of focus on this. I consider this to be very important. I think it's a fundamental thing. You should be able to tell staff what is expected of them at all levels, and indeed all line managers at all levels should be telling staff how they're doing against their targets. Not just how they're performing, but giving them feedback on their behaviour as well, and the way in which they actually do deliver their targets. These things are vitally important to me. And going back to the point about sickness earlier, we know from research that staff who don't feel properly engaged in their organisation are much more likely to take sick. And one of the greatest ways of ensuring there is good staff engagement is if there is feedback between management and staff on performance management issues.
Can I ask that? So, I'm glad you mentioned it. It is a two-way system, because I always have a fear that people, whenever they were asked, I'm just thinking back to whenever we were going through job re-evaluation in a lot of the civil service, and people are writing their own job evaluations, somebody doing exactly the same job, writing their own personal plan of what they were doing. They actually sounded like they were running the country themselves. Certain people were slightly, well, there's an old song, where a boy says he can't bear to look in the mirror because he gets better looking every day and he's perfect in every way. Some people actually have that approach, and I'm wondering, is there any truth in the fact that whenever people are asked to write a personal performance plan, that they actually make it out that they're a whole lot better than what they really are? And I think the person who's most critical of somebody is somebody outside that works along with them, who actually sees where people's strengths and weaknesses are, because sometimes individuals do not want to see their weaknesses, and they're brilliant at telling you all the things they're fantastic at, and it depends how egotistical somebody is as to how their personal performance plan is presented.
Yeah. Well, that shouldn't happen. Individual performance agreements should reflect the key priorities and commitments that each individual has. And, you know, there's a basic principle, which is that every member of staff in the department, at whatever level, you should be able to trace their own performance agreement up through the organisation, and ultimately you should be able to see it reflected in a programme for government commitment of some form or other. So individual performance agreements should be agreed jointly by the line manager and the member of staff. And the evaluations, the in-year performance reviews and the end-year performance reviews should be done by the member of staff and the line manager. And the line manager should be the person that sort of ultimately signs that off. Now, the member of staff has to agree that finally, but it should be done jointly. But managers at a high level should be making sure as well that this process is being properly applied across the organisation. And certainly we've discussed this at our, this issue has been on our departmental board every month. It's also at our fortnightly stocktake meetings. And I've made it clear that completing performance appraisals on staff is a fundamental part of every manager's job. And that anybody who isn't doing this on a sort of consistent basis, their performance isn't satisfactory. So, you know, that's the sort of level of importance we're attaching it now.
Appreciate that there has been an improvement in recent months, because I think earlier on it was only sitting at 50-odd%, 59%, and it's now up to 80%.
Yeah.
Will it be completed by the end of this financial year?
Well, I think we're now above 90% for the completion of end-year assessments for last year. And I would be hoping that performance this year is better. Like, we're putting a lot of attention on this. We'll never get to 100% simply because you've people on long-term sick. You know, you've other cases where it may be just impossible to complete an appraisal, but we should be. The 90% target is challenging, but we should be able to get there, and I would hope we'd make it for the end of this year.
Can I ask, and appreciate that it's something which has come up through contact that we would have with the general public who have a frustration about some areas, and I'm wondering if this would impact upon individuals' personal performance targets. Answering a phone, and if people say, "Oh, we aim to answer a phone within 3 or 4 rings," the fact being that yes, they do. They might well be sitting at their desk and have it set on automatic answer. And this automated approach seems to be a wonderful way of actually diverting work, as opposed to not doing it, you know, or delaying doing it. How many is that ever included? Because a frustration that the general public give me about having to contact government bodies and primarily public bodies, the difficulty they have with going round in the circle on this. If you want so and so, press that, and eventually, if you know the extension of the person you do want, you put it in, and invariably it goes to an answering machine. You put a message in that answering machine, they will answer it when it suits them, not necessarily whenever the customer is available and wants the answer or wants some action taken on. Is that ever included as part of their personal development programmes?
For those staff whose job it is to take calls from the public, their performance agreement should reflect how they're doing. Now, I don't have the details of that. Certainly in enterprise shared services, you know, who would have a lot of staff who are doing that sort of call handling from members of the public, we can get you details of what processes they have to measure performance. I know that they do it in a professional way, but to say I don't have the details of that, we can find that out for you.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
It's something which we are hearing as a frustration about, especially since the technology seems to be available now to actually put people into a loop where they could spend half a day trying to get around the right area.
That shouldn't happen, and it's not in our interest to have people disgruntled with the system at all.
No, I would appreciate that, but the system actually, if there's people there that don't particularly want to deal with something, they can actually create that air of frustration. I'm just wondering on that. Okay. Thank you, David.
Okay, moving on to Programme for Government Targets. This is pages 17 and 22 of your PACS, members. David, just in regard to the devolution of corporation tax, Teresa Villiers recently said that the devolution of these powers will be a complex piece of devolution to deliver, and various work streams are yet to be completed. What are those work streams?
Well, the main one obviously is. Sorry, take a step back. We've been led to believe by the Secretary of State and others that the Prime Minister will offer the First and Deputy First Minister the power to vary the rate of corporation tax by the time of the autumn statement, which is scheduled for the 3rd of December. And in the background, we are engaged with officials from Treasury and HMRC on a variety of issues. Now, the most significant of those is actually the development of a piece of legislation which will go through the House of Commons. That is something that HMRC are working on at the moment. We're not directly involved in that, and I wouldn't say we're being excluded, but it is a matter for them. But we're being assured that legislation which will allow this to happen is ready to go to the House of Commons, and it'll go on a sort of reasonably quick passage such that it'll be on the statute books early in the new year. Now, we here, assuming the power is offered, will need to have a piece of legislation go through the Assembly on a sort of similar track. So that's a piece of work that needs to be done. No reason to believe that can't be done. There are also state aid issues, which again HMRC and Treasury are leading on our behalf with Europe, though we have been involved in some of the discussions there. But there are also some issues in and around the cost of this, which still hasn't been totally nailed down, and there are some issues in and around how the cost will be calculated, where we haven't reached agreement as yet. Now, to put that in context, I was talking to one of my colleagues in the Scottish Government yesterday, and they are actually getting the power to vary landfill tax and stamp duty from next April, and they still haven't got agreement on how their block grant will be adjusted. Now, if we get the power to vary corporation tax, that it's unlikely that we could do so before probably 17-18. So, there's still a lot to be done if this power is taken and then applied.
One of the PFG targets was in relation to the long-haul flights in terms of air passenger duty. Now, obviously that particular target has been achieved, but the Department, along with Department of Enterprise, Trade and Investment, were to come back to the Department in regard to the air connectivity study stage 2, and that seems to have been put on the long finger for some time now. Could you give us an update on where that is at and how big a priority the complete devolution of APD would be for the Minister?
Yeah, we'll need to come back to you. Actually, I myself, when I left DETI, the air connectivity study was underway. I'm not sure just where it's got to. I will find that out for you. APD is one of a number of fiscal measures that we're looking at the moment, and the intention is to bring advice to the Minister shortly on what we believe would be the pros and cons of further devolution of, as I say, different fiscal measures, and APD is one of them.
Okay. Members, any other questions?
Can I just ask one slightly askew? Obviously, this report was done some time ago, because it refers to things happening in April and June and so forth. But just wondering on the rates one, for small business rate relief scheme. It's due to end in April, but there is a feeling that perhaps it should be extended beyond that. Has anything been done or is being done?
It's built into the draft budget. It'll be extended for a year.
So it's a runner, is it?
Yep.
Okay.
Extended?
Yeah.
It was extended for a year and then reviewed.
I don't know what the intention is beyond that, but I'm pretty sure small business rate relief is built into the draft budget. put it this way, if I'm wrong, I will let you know very quickly.
Thank you.
John?
Just a quick question, David, about you're saying that the corporation tax, if it's devolved, it would be at least sort of 17, 18 before we could vary it. Why? What would be the big delay in that lead-in time to that if it's devolved, next year or some point next year, and there's legislation both in Westminster and here possibly to do that?
It's just getting the detailed system design in place such that actually it can be applied. There's quite a lot of work still to be done. Putting the primary legislation will take you sort of an important step towards this, but there's an awful lot more work to be done before before HMRC be in a position to apply a lower rate here and firms avail of it.
Thanks.
Okay, members. David, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Good morning. Members, moving on to the review of the operation of the Barnett formula. Now I have a briefing from Colin from Assembly Research. 3 pieces of research, page 24 to 40. Barnett 2014, pages 41 to 42, possible contacts for fact-finding visits, and pages 43 to 50, Barnett and Bond only. Colin, would you like to take us through these?
Yeah, sure, Chair, I will do. Just to help the Permanent Secretary out there is the Small Business Rates Relief was funded with 20 million in the draft budget, so it's definitely in there. It was one of the questions that we'd raised in the lines of questioning briefing that we provided to the committee, because that seems the decision to continue it seems to have been taken in advance of the evaluation being received. So it was just that was one that we'd flagged up. I think last week it was. Yeah.
You need to be asked again, by the way.
Sorry, but moving on to what I'm supposed to be doing here. My first briefing for the Finance Committee back in 2009 was about the Barnett formula. And I think these papers are numbers 5, 6 and 7 from memory. So basically they've all been saying much the same sort of thing, that the Barnett formula is creaking, and an awful lot of people think it needs to go. There are some people who think it needs to stay. But I suppose if I keep writing papers about it and making the same predictions, sooner or later it will come to pass. I'll come back to you in 15 years' time. It might be a way. So, just for the benefit of the committee, I know we've some new members on the committee. Just to run very quickly through how the Barnett formula works. All it really does is it adjusts the total amount of money that's available to the devolved administrations in response to changes in expenditure plans at the UK level. So, for example, if the UK government decides, and I think in this current context, it's really to reduce rather than to increase expenditure. If they decide to cut expenditure on a policy area or a set of services which is comparable with what's delivered in Northern Ireland, so we'll be talking about most of the big things like education and health, they are fully comparable. So if they decided to cut expenditure by, say, 100 million in education, then Northern Ireland and the other devolved administrations would get a proportional reduction based on their population level. So they would, we would get a smaller reduction than Scotland because we have fewer people. Okay. But what it doesn't do is change the overall level. It just sort of adjusts the edges. So what this paper, or the real paper rather than the sort of lists, is to do is to support the review that the committee decided a few weeks ago to hold. It builds on all those previous papers which I've listed in the introduction. So for those of you who are really interested, there's a whole plethora of material there for you to get stuck into. this paper sets the context and then looks at some inquiries that are going on elsewhere and reviews a couple of new additions to the literature. I suppose in terms of context, the most important thing is that in the run-up to the Scottish referendum, the leaders of the main Westminster parties made this vow, which is on page 4 then, which refers to the continuation of the Barnett allocation for resources. So that's a commitment from the leaders of the UK parties that this is going to continue. Now, certainly on page 6, there's a box that, which got out of what the Treasury have produced a summary of various published proposals by political parties in terms of what they've said about Barnett, and certainly the Lib Dems and Labour have both stated that it should be retained. The question, I think, is not whether it's retained, but how it's retained. Now, moving on to the second part of the paper, then, there's a number of inquiries ongoing, sort of in tandem with this committee's work. And obviously, because those are in process, I think, I understand that the intention is to maybe do some kind of fact-finding mission. So first of all, there's the Scottish Parliament Finance Committee looking at a whole range of issues, which obviously to do with fiscal devolution, how that will affect the block grant, which are just the same as the sort of issues that the Permanent Secretary's just been talking about in terms of corporation tax for here. There's also the Westminster Political Constitutional Reform Committee, again, which is looking at further devolution and how that's going to be done. So what I've suggested there is that just as part of this process, it makes sense to sort of engage with those committees and see where their thinking's going, and that will help inform this committee's thinking. There are also a couple of recently completed inquiries. The City Growth Commission. Now, yes. It was difficult to know whether or not to put some of these things in. This may come to nothing. The City Growth Commission may never achieve anything. I don't know, but the reason it's there is because there are references in it, or in its report rather, to a sort of Barnett-style system and giving consultation rights to metropolitan areas, the same as devolved administrations. And you know, there was a comment that it would be relatively straightforward to introduce a Barnett-style system for cities, which it may be, but whether it's a desirable thing is not the same issue. But I did wonder if maybe this committee might like to see if perhaps some of the members of that commission might like to give evidence, just so you can see if there are any sort of long-term implications from what they proposed in terms of how Northern Ireland might be. There's also the commission in Wales, which I believe members of this committee met with the chairman, Paul Silk, was it? The Silk Commission, anyway. And it wasn't primarily in looking at finance issues, but there was one point I picked out on page 11 that said the transfer of power should be accompanied by and conditional on transfers of funding being fully agreed between the two governments in each case, and by agreed changes to the Barnett formula comparability factors. And that goes to the heart of what the Permanent Secretary was just talking about. If the UK government seems to be in principle happy, from what he was saying, to devolve corporation tax to Northern Ireland, that's one thing. But then working out how you actually do it, and how you adjust what, in essence, is a very simple, straightforward formula, and then start taking bits out of it and saying, right, well, that bit's Barnett, this bit is Barnett as well, but then because you've got that power, we're going to take off a certain amount of money. And at this point in time, we estimate that value to be however many 100 million. But what's it going to be in 5 years' time? And how does the executive plan for where it will be in terms of the block grant in future if there are these adjustments? And it seems to me that if there are going to be a whole devolution's already uneven and asymmetric. If it becomes more asymmetric as a result of what's going to happen over the next few months or years, then the Barnett formula becomes more difficult to sustain, I suppose, because it just becomes attacked from sort of various angles. Then the London Finance Commission. Actually, sorry, that's the City Growth Commission had made the reference to Barnett. It was the London Finance Commission. They said if London was similarly removed from England, an analogous mechanism could easily, if desired, be put in place. That's saying that they could have a London Barnett, basically, a Barnett formula for London. Now, there is a, in my mind, if you take a large area of public expenditure like London out of the current system, so whereby it would be removed from England, as it were, in expenditure terms, then that will have an impact on the total amount of money that is funneled through then various government departments in some way. And potentially then that leads to an impact on the block grant to Northern Ireland, because you would be reducing the amount of money that went in some way. You're basically, at the moment, you have 3 places affected by Barnett. You've got Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. You would also be adding London. So the way that worked, the mechanisms for that, I think, would be interesting to look at. Obviously, it's a proposal at the moment. Then, just briefly, because I know we're running behind time, 2 big points from recent additions to the academic literature that I thought would be well worth highlighting is that David Bell, who known to some of you members here as previous advisor to the Finance Committee in Scotland, he's certainly been here once or twice to give evidence, and Mr. Eisner have published a paper, and they effectively question whether a needs-based grant system, which is one of the things that the committee has considered looking at, whether you can make Barnett needs-based, can be consistent with the notion of semi-autonomous devolved government. And in fact, they go on to say there's a strong case for arguing that the Barnett mechanism is not suited to a more fiscally autonomous style of devolved government in Scotland. Now, if that applies to Scotland, chances are it will also apply to Northern Ireland and Wales in terms of fiscal autonomy or any degree of it. So there's that issue. Is it workable, or will it remain workable? And then there's also the issue of what I've called here Barnett formula and political power, which looks at the way that the Treasury has so much central control over the devolved administration's budgets, and this runs across the whole board. I've just been working on a paper on the way that Northern Ireland has had to access the UK reserve to meet the shortfall of funding for this year, and then the implications for the budget next year. And there are certainly 2 issues there where the Treasury basically has discretion to say, yes, you can do that, no, you can't do that. And that then will influence how the Executive and this Assembly can address the issues of the budget for next year. So the question is maybe whether, if there is to be reform, if you take it as read that Barnett will remain, but it's to be reformed in some way, is there an opportunity then for Northern Ireland to push the case for it to become more transparent, less centrally controlled, to enable the devolved administration then to work more comfortably with the system? So that's all I've got to say. So this is a brief run through. I'll take any questions that you have or not.
In regard to the Treasury, could you say anything about, I mean, there's often tensions between the Treasury. Remember the example of the previous Finance Minister in terms of estimates. Has there been much discussion or analysis of how the Treasury make up these estimates, or how reliable they are?
In terms of the corporation tax, it seems to be an ongoing issue. There is also, I know this committee has raised the issue of how the welfare reform penalty, the level of that penalty was calculated, and I think I'm right in saying that DFP have commissioned NICEP, possibly in the University of Ulster, I think they've commissioned somebody anyway to look at the estimate and see whether or not it's right. So that's clearly an issue that has arisen, at least in those 2 two areas.
And in regard to what Bell was saying about Barnet not being suitable to a more fiscally autonomous style of devolved government in Scotland, was he proposing that in terms of whatever taxes are raised that they just stay within Scotland as opposed to going through?
Well, no. What they were doing was looking at whether the proposals that various Westminster political parties have put forward, or the sort of wider UK parties have put forward, from a perspective of fiscal federalist theory. So it's a theoretical paper. I don't think he was advancing, or the authors were advancing any particular position. What they were doing was trying to examine the current arrangements within through a particular sort of theoretical lens.
Hey, John.
Thanks, Chair. Probably a bit of a question or a comment. You know, you used the example, Colin, of London, if you almost took London out of England.
Yeah.
But where would you be then? Surely if you start that in Birmingham. Thanks, Peter. That brought the clarity that I needed. Well, you know, if you added in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, you know, you could end up almost in a situation if you were going down this road of giving levels of autonomy to those major cities, particularly, you know, when you'd add, you would end up with a situation that you could have almost half of England's population, you know, on the
Yeah, at a sort of devolved level. Yeah, well, certainly
I don't know many cities.
Coalition government have certainly played lip service to a localism agenda. They've talked about pushing more powers down to local government, but I suppose it's probably debatable the degree to which local government itself would say that power has been devolved.
What if you ended up in that
situation? You would end up with a patchwork, and I don't see.
The current system couldn't survive that.
Well, it's hard. I can't say, but I can't see how it can. Not in its current form. There would have to be change, I would think. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Colin.
Okay, I'll leave you in Alan's capable hands.
Okay, members, can I propose that staff come back with options for fact-finding visits to the suggested contacts in the research paper, and I'll be scheduled further evidence based on the suggestions in the research papers. Reid? Yeah.
We're getting to Clare House again.
Aye. 2 hours and 2 years.
Yes.
Moving on, members, the briefing from Professor Alan Trench and Professor Gerald Holtham. Can I advise members that this session will be conducted via Skype, as well as having a witness at the table. Given that we've not taken this combined approach before, there may be some teething problems. I would ask members to remain as quiet as possible whenever a question is being directed to the witness to avoid interference in the audio feed. And members should try to ask one question at a time and speak at a slower than normal pace, as there may well be a slight time delay in transmission. Nothing to do with your accents, of course. It may assist the witness who is using Skype if members introduce themselves at the beginning of asking their questions. So can I welcome Alan Trench to the committee? Good to see you again, Alan.
Chairman, good to see you again.
Hopefully we'll have Professor Holtham with us shortly. Okay, members, can I also welcome Professor Gerald Holtham to the committee via Skype. Very welcome, Professor.
Half there.
Can you hear us okay, Professor?
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
I can hear you, I think, just about.
Good, good. Okay, first of all, we'll ask the both witnesses to introduce themselves and also outline any relevant biographical information, and then make an opening statement. So we'll start with you, Professor Trench, and then move on to yourself, Professor Oldham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Alan Trench. I am, among other things, an honorary fellow of Edinburgh University and formerly a professor of politics at the University of Ulster. I've been working on aspects of devolution finance for about 7 years now, and my experience in relation to this has included acting as specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on the Barnett Formula, which reported in 2009, and on the Wales Bill and the implementation of the Silk Commission's report on fiscal devolution for Wales in my capacity as Specialist Advisor to the House of Commons Select Committee on Welsh Affairs.
Thank you, Professor Trench. Professor Oldham, if you could make some introductory remarks, and also could you slightly lower the camera, as all we can see is your forehead at this moment.
Oh, lovely. You can just, let me see, how's that?
That's great, thank you.
Tell me if it goes too low.
That's too low. Too low. That's it now.
I'm going to have to adjust my chair. Yes, my name is Gerald Holtham. I'm an honorary professor at Cardiff University. I chaired the Welsh Government's independent commission into devolution finance. So I've been working on it since 2008, and I've also given evidence to the Scottish Parliament on aspects of fiscal devolution there.
Okay, can I ask a question first of all? How is convergence affected by different influences? For example, population growth, additional public spending versus austerity, Whitehall spending priorities, etc. Alan, if you would like to go first.
Convergence is an arithmetical property of the Barnett formula, because what the Barnett formula does is it allocates a version of spending changes that are made for England to devolved governments, but it can never allocate to them more than 100% of what the changes are for England, even though the relative needs of all three devolved governments are pretty clearly, as we know thanks to the Holtham Commission's work, greater than those of England. So convergence is something that is built into the system and ought to happen. It appears to have happened to a degree for Northern Ireland. It has happened to a more significant degree for Wales, and because Wales is now below its figure of relative need, this becomes a pressing political issue there. It doesn't appear to have occurred in relation to Scotland, and that is something of a puzzle. Now, one of the aspects of convergence is that it should occur, and should occur more, the more public spending increases in nominal terms. And of course, during the 2000s, it increased very significantly under the various Labour governments. The best explanation for this appears to be that, of course, you use population figures for Barnett that are to establish the comparability ratios that by definition are somewhat out of date, because you use the mid-year figure usually from the year of the spending review. That is normally itself an estimate based on extrapolations that ultimately derive from the census. But that figure will be a little out of date when the spending period starts, and 3 years out of date by the time that spending review period ends. Scotland's population has been declining significantly for a considerable time, certainly since the 1970s, if not earlier. It's been, at least initially, a consequence of deindustrialisation. And that trend continued through most of the 2000s. It appears to have reversed about 2007. And the explanation appears to be that even within those 3-year spending review period, the decline was enough to cancel out the convergence effect that should otherwise have been taking place. Now, whether that's going to carry on happening in Scotland is a moot point, because Scotland's population is now once again declining, but at a significantly slower a rate than it was declining up to about 2007. The rate of decline appears now, according to ONS forecast, to be around 0.1% per year, as opposed to 0.3% per year. So convergence is quite likely to bite in Scotland. It appears to have bitten already to a material degree in Northern Ireland, and bites quite painfully in Wales. There's one other factor I think that's material in the context of whether convergence or indeed divergence happens. And one of the things that appears to have happened since the coalition came to office in Westminster in 2010 is a material degree of divergence starting to emerge or re-emerge. And that is because of the spending choices that have been made by the coalition in the way it has delivered austerity so far. It has sheltered school spending, education spending, and health spending in England. And those are, by some distance, the largest spending items for devolved governments as well, certainly as far as the DEL element of the Northern Ireland budget is concerned, and for the whole budget in Scotland and Wales. So the sheltering of health and education has actually protected devolved governments from some of the impacts that austerity has had within England, where the impact has been borne particularly by departments such as Justice, the Home Office, and local government, which account for much lower proportions of devolved spending than education and health.
Professor Holdham.
Yes, the Barnett formula will give you some degree of divergence at a time if nominal public spending is being, that's just the same effect as the convergence you get when public spending is growing. And it's simple enough to understand. The amount that it per head is the same in cash terms. So if there's a cash cut, there'll be a smaller percentage of your per head expenditure than of England's, because your per head expenditure baseline is higher than England's. Therefore, you some divergence simply as if nominal spending is being cut. So, in that sense, the formula is symmetrical. And we have seen in Wales, for example, that the ratio of public spending in Wales to the rest of the UK has risen by a percentage point since 2009, presumably as a result of austerity. So while austerity is absolutely bad, it's relatively good in the sense that it hits the devolved territory a little less hard than in England. I think the other thing to say is my understanding is that the Barnett formula does not correct for population changes as far as the level of the formula is concerned. It just works on the increment. So if you, whatever the formula was last year, that is, Barnett will be looking at the change in expenditure in England per head by the consequential gain per devolved territory. If your population is evolving very differently from England, that will have an effect on your expenditure per head, because the historic bit of the grant, if you like, is not adjusted. I think that partly explains why we haven't seen much convergence in Scotland, because, as Professor French said, they've been suffering population declines, which would tend to raise their expenditure per head on the Barnett formula.
John.
I suppose just bringing in all of those, it was good to see you again, Alan, Professor Holden. Following on really from the, I know the professor didn't see the research session, but basically what we were talking about was some of the pressures that might put on Barnett if you started to devolve some physical autonomy to London, and even if you extended that into other larger cities across England, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. And then does it take in all this sort of leads into the entire debate of you know, the constitutional setup of the United Kingdom, what powers go where, the Treasury, how much central control they need, and how does Barnett formula cope with that? Something that was designed in the late 70s. How does it cope with that very, very changed constitutional setup that the UK might look like over the next few years?
Well, I think all experience shows the Treasury will try and make the minimum change possible. They will look for a fund other than a written branch reform, the whole system coherent or consistent. I mean, we have plenty of experience. That's the way the British government responds. The thing about devolution within England is there hasn't been any real talk of devolving tax powers. They have given the ability to borrow, and they may be given a little more latitude to change council tax than they had in the past. The cap may be eased or something like that. But there's no suggestion of, so far anyway, of devolving significant tax powers to English regions or localities. And I think the Treasury can be relied upon to resist doing so. So I'm not sure how far they will see it as impacting on Barnett. To the extent that devolving powers to the currently devolved territories is concerned, the whole issue there is how you value the tax that you are devolving and what effect that has on the top line. And those questions will come up, irrespective really of how the block is determined. It could be just on it, or it could be a proper-based formula. But whatever it is, you still have the issue of, if I've given you a tax base, what price am I going to ask you for that tax base? How much am I going to reduce the block grant that you get? And I think that is a big issue which will occur now in the future, but it will occur whether the Barnett formula is reformed or not.
First Strange.
Let me start with the constitutional side of that question, and then I'll come to talk about England. One of the things about the Barnett formula is that it was devised for a politically very different situation, not merely an economically different situation. Well, actually, arguably, an economically rather similar situation. It was designed to deal with a great period of financial stress and the need to impose spending restraint very quickly across UK government. But it was designed to deal with doing that in the context of a single UK government, in which all spending ministers were bound by cabinet collective responsibility, all formed part of the same administration, dependent on a majority in one legislature in the House of Commons. And its use for devolution is a decision I discovered was taken with remarkable speed and remarkable lack of debate or discussion, but simply applied that existing mechanism to a situation where you were creating now 3 new legislatures with their own distinct political composition and accountability and policy ideas. So to use a system that is designed for that setting in the new setting has always struck me as being somewhat odd. And what the Barnett formula does, because it delivers changes in spending according to decisions that are made about spending in England, is that it contains within it an implicit assumption that devolved governments will, broadly speaking, be happy with the overall pattern of public services within England. If you dramatically alter the pattern of spending within England, that feeds through the block grant. Now, we have seen an example of that happen in relation to higher education already, because as part of the package that came when the Coalition looked at the Brown report on university fees in England, it also slashed the teaching grant. The grant that supports teaching within universities that was formerly allocated by the Higher Education Funding Council for England to English universities to support all humanities and social science subjects. So with the possible exception of mathematics, depending on how you decide to classify mathematics. All those subjects suddenly lost government support. If you study English or history or politics in an English university, the costs of your higher education are entirely being paid for through your tuition fees. There is no longer any public funding going in to support the teaching of those subjects in universities, in contrast to medicine or mathematics or sciences. And that cut in the teaching grant in turn fed through into devolved block grants, because the teaching grant is allocated as part of the BIS budget, and so it went through the Barnett mechanism as a reduction and was subject to the multiple that applies to spending changes for BIS, which I'm just looking at the Statement of Funding Policy, and I see that the figure for that is 79.1% in Scotland, 78.4% for Wales, and 79.2% for Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland will have had a population share of that cut multiplied by 79.2%. Now, that has had a measurable effect, particularly in Wales where funding is tightest. It becomes tighter if the more money is involved. If you were dramatically to change the funding basis of the NHS in England, then this would start to have a very dramatic effect on what devolved governments are able to do if they're simply reliant on the block grant. And a decision ultimately is going to need to be made. Are devolved governments willing to accept essentially being able to do a version of what goes on within England? Or do they want to be in a position to make meaningfully different policy choices for themselves? Not just at the margin in a fairly limited way, but in a broader way. The second thing about Barnett, to answer the second point of your question about what happens within England, is that Barnett necessarily uses England as its reference point. Now, that makes sense because England is so much the largest part of the United Kingdom. And the attitude that accompanied the introduction of Barnett in the 1970s, and indeed its application to funding devolved governments in the 1990s, was that devolved government should get a share of what's being done in relation to England, of what the UK government's doing in relation to England. If you start fragmenting what goes on within England, that certainly creates difficulties because you simply lose your reference point. Every system that operates any sort of grant funding arrangements needs a reference point. Usually it's some sort of national average, either of tax capacity or spending need. Because England is so big, England serves that function within the United Kingdom. But if you were to go down the path of meaningful fiscal devolution within England, you do end up in some tangles. Now, I would certainly agree with Professor Holtham, there's not much sign actually of that happening at the moment. There have been pitches made in relation to London for the devolution of stamp duty or for the assignment of its revenues. Those have been rejected by George Osborne. There have been suggestions that there might be further devolution of the non-domestic rate within England. There's been some movement on that, not a great deal. There's been a suggestion by the Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee that income tax revenues should be assigned to fund local government services within England. Again, that's not had any traction within Treasury. And I'm not sure that there's going to be a huge amount of progress in that sense. And until there is, I suspect that this is a thing to think about rather than a thing actually actively to worry about.
I suppose a couple of points on that. I mean, if in your point, Alan, that you see more of policy divergence between what's happening in England and the devolved administration, you know, for example, in Scotland, different decisions on tuition fees, on here we've different decisions say on water charging, we're not doing that, prescription charging, all of that. Will there not come pressure from English regions that might want that power over time, except maybe that's not in a debate at the minute, but are we entering into a period now of a fairly fluid mix of what might change in the constitutional setup of the UK?
We're in a fluid period, but it is a very, very fluid period. And part of the issue in relation to England is it's unclear what England wants. It's unclear what it wants in terms of devolution by way of area. It's unclear what it wants by way of powers. There's a lot of talk about devolution within England, as well as to England through the mechanism of Westminster and English votes for English laws. But it's not very coherent at the moment. So there's a debate, but where this debate ends up is quite hard to say, and the timescale on which it's likely to end up is even harder to say.
And maybe just a quick one for Professor Holtham is about, you know, in Wales now they've had problems with funding due to the convergence. I mean, it's probably been the reason that we've been reluctant to open up the Barnett debate here much, because we've been doing maybe reasonably well out of it. The points around central government in London protecting this coalition administration, protecting health and education. Has it an impact on us? There are some bits in health that we're falling behind because social care here is part of our Department of Health, and it's separate in England. So it does have some. There's some issues around our health and social care funding that are starting to show signs of pressure. But generally, we've been shielded. Is Barnett now because the Welsh aren't doing as well? And is there a major push there to open this up for debate and move to a needs-based judgment on it?
Well, there's always been pressure in Wales to look at the Barnett formula, or at least there has been for 6 or 7 years now. But as you say, Northern Ireland hasn't done too badly. I think you're only maybe a few years away from being in the same position if once public spending starts to grow again. But certainly in the past and at the moment, you're probably doing okay. But the Scots, of course, would suffer if a needs-based adjustment were introduced to Barnett. And so I think the pressure for change has been pretty local. It's been pretty local to Wales, and there's been strong resistance to change from Scotland. And as they have more parliamentary seats, that's been the dominant consideration. And as you saw from the vow that was made at the time of the Scottish referendum, Westminster politicians are quite sensitive to that and are not showing any readiness to adapt at the present time. If I may, I would like to disagree with Professor Trench on one point. We usually see eye to eye. I have a great respect for his knowledge in this area, but there's one area where I do disagree. And that is, you know, take a step back. There are only two ways to make an adjustment to the public spending capabilities of different areas. You either say, look, you're a poorer area, so you don't raise as much tax. So we'll adjust your revenue. We'll adjust your revenue to the same level as the rest of the kingdom. Now, if that's all you did, which, by the way, is what's done in most federations, your expenditure per head would be the same as England's, because you'd be getting the same revenue per head. So a revenue adjustment would not be as good for the devolved territories as the current Barnett-based adjustment. The Barnett-based adjustment is not based on revenue. It's based on expenditure. And although it's not fully needs adjusted at the moment, it's derived from history where there was a higher level of public expenditure in the devolved territories because they needed it. They were sparser, their population was sparser, which is more expensive to service. They were poorer, so there were more social problems that had to be tackled by public spending. So it's only an expenditure-based adjustment that's going to give you the kind of resources that you currently have. If you move to a revenue-based adjustment, you are going to be worse off. Now, how can you do an expenditure-based adjustment except by basing it on those expenditures which are devolved? And now, Professor Trench says the trouble is that ties you into the expenditure pattern in England because the grant is derived from the expenditures they're making in areas that are devolved to you. But in my opinion, that objection is answered by the fact that the grant is fully fungible. It doesn't matter where it comes from. You can spend it on whatever you like. So they may decide to abolish the National Health Service, which would hugely reduce your grant. But if you wish then to spend the money on health and slash the education service or something, you would be able to do it. The real complaint is, or the real difficulty that Northern Ireland is in, just the same as Wales, is that it receives such a very large grant. So much money is coming from the grant, and if England decides to cut public expenditure, that will have a disproportionate impact on Wales and Northern Ireland. But I don't think there's any alternative to that. You cannot ask the English to provide public services to the devolved territories at a higher level than they are prepared to vote for themselves. You know, that's the problem is, because they are paying the piper, they are going to call the tune. The precise tune you have power to alter because of fungibility, but you can't. If England elects a government that is going to slash public expenditure and you don't wish to do it, you can't say to them, well, give us a subsidy at a higher level than you're prepared to support your own people at. Their answer will be, if you want to have more public spending, raise your local taxes. Because, the real problem we've got is that Wales and Northern Ireland are in receipt of a very large subsidy. That's the problem. And he who pays the piper calls the tune, and there's no escape from it. I don't think Professor Trench is right in saying it's down to the way that the consequentials are derived from Barnett. I think that's irrelevant. Your problem is the size of the subsidy, and the fungibility provides a partial answer to that. So unless you want to move to a revenue-based adjustment, which would make you worse off, I think there's really not any practical alternative to what's being suggested. Now, the Scots do have a practical alternative. Because they're not in receipt of a very large subsidy, if you count the North Sea oil as belonging largely to them, you could assign all the tax revenues that they collect to them, and they wouldn't have to have very much of a block grant. Unfortunately, and I speak as a Welshman, so it is unfortunate, this is not true of Wales and Northern Ireland. We are in receipt of a large net subsidy. That's our problem.
If I might come back on a couple of points.
1 minute.
I'd certainly entirely agree that if you're a recipient region, as Northern Ireland is and Wales is, you cannot expect to receive an overall higher quality of public services than the people than the unit that's paying for this effectively is contributing to that, which is also in this case the reference point. That, as it were, the English norm necessarily is going to be the norm, and there are things you might be able to do about that if you have fiscal devolution at the margin, but it depends on the degree to which you have fiscal devolution and the taxes to which it applies. There are at least a couple of federal systems that do operate systems of equalisation that combine both revenue equalisation and spending equalisation. Australia and Germany both do that. The more centralised of the federal systems. Of course, the difference is that they are symmetrical. All the states and territories of Australia have the same spending responsibilities. All the Länder of Germany have the same spending responsibilities. So you work out the reference point for that in relation to a national average. And you can't do that in the same way in the United Kingdom, because only Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have devolution, and that's why we end up necessarily using England as the reference point.
Okay, Michaela.
Thank you. You're very welcome, Professor Trench and Professor Holtham. I suppose my question is to Professor Trench, because I can hear you a wee bit better. Apologies to Professor Holtham. I suppose the current discussion around fiscal powers and indeed the role of Barnett should begin from our perspective of what we're trying to achieve here, and that being ensuring that our executive is fully able to create jobs, tackle inequality, and that we can do that with the changes. But what changes or additional powers would you identify as central to achieving this? What specific changes and powers would be key to that?
Devolved governments already have quite a significant number of levers in their hands. They've got, in particular, many of the tools relating to the active labour market, and indeed through the nature of welfare devolution here, it would be possible to take that even further forward. You're not tied into the structure of Job Centre Plus in the way that governments are in Great Britain. You've also, of course, got things like vocational education already within the hands of devolved governments. Now, one of the issues, obviously, that has widely discussed here as a way of trying to stimulate the economy is the idea of the devolution of corporation tax and the use of a lower rate of corporation tax as a means of trying to spur economic activity. As you may know, I'm rather sceptical about the value of devolving corporation tax. I think that it may well be a case for Northern Ireland to beware what you wish for. The devolution of corporation tax would put you within the ambit of some very restrictive rules that would necessarily be quite tightly enforced, notably by the European Commission in relation to the state aids issue. And that would mean that, of course, you would have to establish the amount of corporation tax that was attributable to Northern Ireland. You would have to make an actual cut in spending that correlated to that estimate of revenue. Also, you'd have to make a cut in the block grant that related to that amount of revenue. You would have to ensure that that cut in the block grant was adjusted in subsequent years by a mechanism that satisfied state aids tests, that the cut was sufficiently robust and the methodology for adjusting the cut was sufficiently robust to do that. So I suspect you would have the Commission taking quite a close eye, keeping quite a close eye on what happens here. And you would then, assuming that a cut in the rate of corporation tax was made once you had obtained devolution of it, have to apply an actual cut in spending to Northern Ireland's budgets. So you would have to make a very tangible and probably rather substantial cut in immediate public spending, which would clearly be uncomfortable. It's very obvious from the experiences that Northern Ireland's had, despite being comparatively generously funded in the last few years, that would be a difficult and uncomfortable experience. And you would have to, I think all you would really be able to offer as politicians to your voters is the assurance that at some point in the future this would spur enough economic activity that it would both reduce the demand for public services and increase the tax revenues available to pay for them. But that would necessarily be a case of a cut today in the hope of a benefit tomorrow. And that's going to be quite a tough thing to do.
Okay, thank you, Professor Trench. Professor Holtham, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think one area to look at is the borrowing powers of the devolved authority. I imagine this is the same in Northern Ireland as elsewhere, that very large projects, if you wish to undertake them, would command an excessive share of your annual capital budget. And you don't have the capability, without borrowing powers, of spreading those expenditures over a long period of time. So you are inhibited, therefore, from undertaking large infrastructure investments. Now, I don't know whether there are such investments in Northern Ireland or not, but if there are, you're hampered. So I think an agreement would allow you to accumulate a certain amount of debt in relation to your annual income, some sort of reasonable level, would help you at least to be able to contemplate larger projects. It would also partly get around the problem that Professor Trench just alluded to. If you were able to finance your capital expenditures by borrowing and to transfer some of your current capital expenditures to the recurrent account, you could fill the gap that was left by a cut in your revenue, a cut in your block grant. Of course, at the moment, the Treasury doesn't allow you to move money from capital to recurrent expenditure, only the other way. So if you had greater freedom of your use of the block grant, that restriction between recurrent and capital expenditure was abolished, and you had borrowing powers, you could do more. Of course, you could also make terrible mistakes and go to hell in a handbasket. That's also true, but you would have the power if you made the right decisions to do more things. The general point I'd make is the Treasury is afraid of tax competition, which is why it's not happy about ceding corporation tax to Northern Ireland, because it's afraid that this will lead to tax competition, to people moving around just for tax reasons. Other areas then have to follow. You get just a general destruction of the tax base. This is a legitimate concern. It also affects, I think, the ability to devolve the higher rates of income tax. You don't want all your millionaires going to live in one place because the tax rates are lower, forcing everybody else to reduce the tax. But I think the answer to this is not a blanket ban and saying we can't devolve these taxes. The answer to this is protocols that say, look, a tax expenditure is like any other expenditure. If we have a poor area of the country, we may be ready to see EU funds go there, or we may be ready to send regional development funds there ourselves. So there is a limited amount of tax revenue we are prepared to sacrifice if it helps that, but only a limited amount. We can't have them themselves into the Isle of Man or something like that. So you need protocols. I think you could devolve any tax if you're prepared to set what latitude you're devolving with it. How much are you allowed to cut corporation tax? How much are you allowed to cut of income tax? And if these are specified within reasonably tight limits, then I think the objection to devolving them goes away. I think the trouble you've got with corporation tax is the Treasury already knows what you want to do with it. It knows you want to cut it to the same rate as the Republic, and therefore it can work out it's going to cost it a lot of revenue, and it's going to try and sting you with the bill. And I think that is the difficulty. If you can devolve these things with a protocol, but the answer to your question, I think, is greater freedom with block grant, more fungibility between capital and revenue expenditure, and a reasonable ability to borrow.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. That's very interesting.
Can I ask as well, given the lack of transparent and independent public finance data, it leads to these situations where the Treasury are making all sorts of estimates in regard to the devolution of further powers. How can that issue be addressed in order to provide an assurance to the devolved administrations that any devolution of further powers, further fiscal powers, is on the basis of a fair and proportionate adjustment to the block grant?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. I think that is a very difficult issue, and it's one that the Commission I chaired looked at in some detail. The bad news that we came up with was it's very difficult to find a general formula that you would want to apply to all taxes that would work. The truth is that different taxes have different characteristics, and the way that you want to structure the deduction from the block grant differs from tax to tax. Nobody liked that message, and we didn't like it ourselves, but it really does seem to be the case. For example, on income tax, we devised a measure for how you treat the deduction from the block grant, which the Treasury initially said was too complicated. We persuaded the Scots that it was the measure they should have, and so the Scots said, no, if we get income tax, we want the deduction from the block grant to be done according to the Welsh formula, and the Treasury finally rolled over and agreed to that. But then when they were discussing with your civil servants how they would deduct, how they would treat deductions from the block grant for any corporation tax that was devolved, they said, oh, and we'll use the Hotham formula for how we treat the block grant, which would be disastrous in the case of corporation tax. So that was a case in point where one size simply didn't fit all. What made sense for income tax made no sense for corporation tax. So you probably don't want me to go through each tax one at a time and tell you what I think the answer is, but the broad answer is, you have to look at the structure of the tax. Is the tax base growing? Is your tax base going to be growing faster or smaller, or faster or slower rather, than the tax base in the UK as a whole? Things like that. You need to look at the structure of each tax, project how it's going to behave in the future before you can derive a reasonable formula for how you reduce the block grant. You see, in year one, it's easy. In year one, you just say, well, okay, last year this tax brought in X, so we'll knock X off the block grant. But you can't keep doing that, otherwise you haven't devolved the tax, because any change to the tax receipts rather, is immediately offset by the block grant. But if you think about that for a minute, you realize, there's not been any devolution, because your resources are always the same, irrespective of what happens to the tax receipt. So you can't do that going forward. There has to be some other way of indexing the block grants, the reduction in the block grant to rises in the price level. And unfortunately, as I say, the sensible way to do that for each tax depends on things like how fast the tax base is growing in your country and how fast it's growing elsewhere in the UK. And that'll be different for different taxes. So my advice is resist any one-size-fits-all formulae and insist on looking at each tax one at a time.
Professor Trench.
Forgive me, Chairman. Were you asking about the impact of changes in the block grant in relation to tax devolution, or in relation to further devolved spending functions?
Further devolution?
Further tax devolution, because there's a set of issues that Mr Pidgeon was drawing attention to in his presentation, raised by the Silk Commission in Wales, because exactly the same issue, where the devolution of further functions is a very active issue, and where ensuring that those functions come across with adequate funding is also, therefore, a substantial issue. And indeed, there have been some issues, problems in Scotland, where devolution of rail franchising did not come with adequate funding. So there's an issue about further devolution of substantive functions as well, if that ever happened in Northern Ireland.
I would like to underline that, Chairman. That's, I think, very compelling to Professor Trench on that. It is the case that, given austerity, the British government will be very happy to give you functions without the money. And obviously, again, one has to look at each function as it's proposed.
Indeed, and of course, as part of the devolution of council tax benefit within Great Britain, it deliberately transferred 10% less than the last year's level of funding that was needed to deal with that. So we've already seen this move from being something that happens in practice to becoming an actual policy. But to talk about tax devolution, and I would say without a moment's hesitation, Professor Holtham is the expert here. The work that his commission did has been the landmark work that has been the reference in Scotland for dealing with these issues. And I would entirely agree that you have, on the one hand, a single approach does not work. But equally, you want to have something that is going to be as reliable and predictable as possible as your mechanism for making the adjustment to the block grant in subsequent years. Because what you desire from the point of view of making fiscal devolution work is to make that cut in the block grant as firmer budget constraint as possible. It can never be a hard budget constraint, but there are degrees of firmness, and you want to be at the firmer rather than the softer end to ensure that this actually creates a meaningfully transparent and durable system. That said, I start to have some quite serious worries about what would happen if you were to apply the sort of approach that Professor Holtham's outlined and is being appears to be being rolled out in Scotland. For income tax at least, when you get sort of more, say 8 or 10 years down the road. Because what you're going to end up with is going to be a calculation of what the block grant would have been, a mechanism for making a reduction from that block grant to allow that will apply a multiplier to the initial pound sum, that in the case of income tax will be the overall growth in the UK tax base that may or may not relate to the growth of the size of the devolved tax base. It may well become increasingly hard to identify what the growth of the devolved tax base would have been absent tax devolution, not least because there will be behavioural changes. If you've got a different tax rate, people will do things differently. So working out what they would have done if they hadn't done something is going to become increasingly difficult. I mean, it's a bit like the the exercise that now goes on, certainly in England and Wales, if you build a new property and you have to have a banding for council tax purposes. So you have to work out what the value of that property would have been if that property had existed in 1991. This is a rather farcical thing to be doing in 2014. And I suspect that where you will get to after a number of years will be that there will be some real problems about the increasingly notional character of several of these calculations. And I would rather forestall that and put in place a more rational system earlier on. But I think that one would certainly say there is going to be a need for a review within a number of years to look at these issues hard and again.
May I just make a point there, Chair, because Professor Trent puts his finger on a real problem, and it's a problem which I don't think there is a complete solution to. Namely, if you devolve tax powers in such a way that the devolved territory has responsibility and takes the consequence for its actions, you cannot at the same time ensure that it is protected against things outside its control. You know, there's just no way to do that. So therefore, if you say, well, we're going to put some weight on the devolution being genuine, so if they change policy, they get the consequences of their actions, you can't fully protect them from them outside events that might make them worse or better off for reasons that are beyond their control. And I don't think there's any way to square that circle. So you do have to decide which is more important, whether the devolution is genuine or whether you're going to have full protection against things that you can't help. My own solution, and I fully admit that it's a sticking plaster solution, is as Professor French says, after a certain number of years, be it 10 or 15, you have to recalibrate. You have to go back to the beginning and start again. You say, okay, let's say that we devolved income tax to Scotland or Northern Ireland. We indexed to the UK tax base, and lo and behold, for no fault of their own, their tax base has grown more slowly, so they now have, after 10 years, fewer resources than equivalent parts of the UK. Or maybe they've been made mistakes and they have smaller tax base because of their policy errors. Either way, we can't unscramble that. We have to recalibrate. We go back to square one and start again after 10 or 15 years. My argument is 10 or 15 years is long enough to incentivize politicians to try and improve matters within their programs, if you like. But we can't have a situation in which one part of the kingdom is getting remorselessly richer than the rest without compensation. So I do think we have to, 15 years or so at least, we have to just recalibrate, go back to square one. And I don't see any alternative to that. I would be very ready to accept something better, because it isn't very good, but I haven't been able to think of anything.
Leslie?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. One of the difficulties I see is the fact that we have not been able to achieve convergence over the years. I just would welcome views from both of you on an idea of interest-free medium-term loans from government, from the central government, to allow the regional economies to grow. For example, they could meet the cost of the corporation tax, of APD in the short term, and therefore allow the revenues to build up to make the whole thing worthwhile, create employment, create more taxation, etc.
Well, I do think that greater borrowing powers is an appropriate form of devolution. Now, you're suggesting that in effect you borrow from the UK government. That's certainly one way of doing it. Equally, you could issue your own bonds on the market and do it that way. So I think I'm in favor of the idea. One of the problems is, at the moment, if you don't have any tax powers, suppose you borrow money, and suppose you do clever things with it, you put infrastructure in place, and you achieve convergence GDP per head in Ireland than the rest of the UK. While you're getting a block grant and you don't have any tax revenues, Northern Ireland's better off, but the Northern Irish government is not, because it's still getting a block grant. And you're not able to internalise in your revenue the advantages of the investment you've undertaken. So how are you going to repay the loan? Even if it's interest-free, you've got to pay it back. You're not getting any more revenue to do it. So it does seem to me that the power to borrow, with your accepting some tax devolution, because when you make investments, you achieve more convergence, you then get more revenue. It enables you to repay your loan. If you don't get more revenue, how do you repay the loan without squeezing public services? So I think the borrowing and some tax devolution have to go together.
Thank you, Phil. I was thinking, for example, FDI, foreign direct investment. If we had the lower corporation tax, we could attract that and gain the revenues from that in due course.
That's right, but that's because you've got the tax involved. I think the point I'm making is whichever taxes you get, you need a tax devolution if you're going to borrow, because otherwise it's difficult to repay the borrowing without squeezing your other expenditure. So the corporation tax is one example. There could be others as well. But I do think the two go together.
Thank you.
I don't have very much to add to that, except I would raise, as wearing my lawyerly hat, some serious questions about whether there wouldn't be state aid rules breaches if you were to be given interest-free loans by the UK government for particular purposes, particularly if those involved supporting tax cutting. That smacks to me of regional selective assistance in a way that's contrary to state aid rules. So I think you would have some very real legal problems there.
So the Osborne example isn't good enough then?
The Osborne?
Yes, was getting this special loan for a year to sort of soften the blow of
that's in relation to general revenues, not in relation to supporting a particular attempt to stimulate the economy. It's when you're trying to affect private enterprise that you're going, which appears to be the objective of what you have in mind, that you're going to create the state aid rules. I suspect also that you actually said medium-term loans. There is, again, I would suspect that the Commission would take a rather different view about emergency short-term funding and medium-term funding that might well turn out to be longer than medium-term funding.
Okay, thank you.
Medium-term funding now, the British government can borrow at less than 2%. So, you don't have to run the state aid problem by insisting the loan's tax-free. Just take it at 1.5%. If you can't make that work, maybe you shouldn't be doing it.
Can I ask, given the radically changing political landscape across Britain and in Scotland, and the possibility of a federal Scotland, Devo Max, more powers for Wales, and the devolution of corporation tax and perhaps other powers to Belfast. When or if that happens, is that the time for the formula to be recalibrated?
One of the things, I was intrigued listening to Mr. Pidgeon's presentation earlier when he talked about the wave of criticism there has been for quite a long time regarding the Barnett formula. The Barnett formula has been regarded as dysfunctional since certainly the middle 1980s. And has been denounced in various terms and by various people since then. Yet it remains remarkably persistent, and that's a combination of politics and administrative convenience. And the Barnett formula, without doubt, does offer some very meaningful administrative virtues. It's worth bearing those in mind. From the point of view of devolved governments and finance ministers, it provides stable and predictable funding for 3-year periods. and indeed on longer terms than that, which is very, very valuable. It insulates you from the risks of volatility of tax flows and the need to work out how you're going to finance public spending given the uncertainty of those tax flows. And that's a significant advantage. And from the Treasury's point of view, it becomes a very, very simple accounting exercise to work out what devolved governments get, and also to work out the additional costs of any changes in spending for England, because the Treasury will know that that's going to stick roughly 15% on a wholly devolved function. So it's a fair, as it were, you're working, if you're the Treasury, in 85 pence pounds. Every 85 pence you spend is going to cost you an extra £1. So the Barnett formula has those mechanisms. I suspect that the politics now are going to mean it's going to be very, very hard to change, however, because of the nature of the vow that was made in the last days of the Scottish referendum campaign to protect the Barnett formula in relation to Scotland. I think again that people in Scotland would be wise to be careful what they wish for. Because preserving the Barnett formula, given its various administrative shortcomings and some of the other problems it presents, is not necessarily an appropriate way to build a further form of significant devolution, enhanced devolution for Scotland. Which won't, one might add, be Devo Max, which normally brings with it the assumption of full fiscal autonomy, and that's certainly not going to happen as part of what's currently underway. So while there are very good reasons to question it, equally it shows little signs of dying just yet, as it has shown little sign of dying for about 20 years.
Would you agree, Professor Oldham?
I'm afraid I do, although I think there's a little bit of wiggle room if they wanted to use it, because what do we mean by the Barnett formula? It's just a spreadsheet. Now, suppose I stuck an extra pen on the spreadsheet, just one little needs adjustment on it, said 10, you get 100. I could the Barnett formula, just a formula. So the point is, you need to change the Barnett formula that radically to introduce an element of adjustment. You don't have to. There's this sort of weird discussion that goes on that says either we have the Barnett formula or we have something fantastically complicated with 1 million variables in it. Well, you know, I reject that as a false choice. If we put 4 or 5 variables into it, the Barnett formula would be just as simple to administrate as is at the moment, or pretty well, and get 80% or 90% of the advantages that you get if you had 1 million variable, totally complicated formula. In other words, we don't have to make the best the enemy of the good. You could make a rough and ready adjustment that would sort out 90% of the problem and leave you with a system very much like Barnett, but with a small tweak on the end. And I think that's what we are, and we even showed how you might do it. But I think it's the political, not the administrative problems that are blocking any change. If people had the political will, it would be possible to do.
Can I ask as well, in addition to the more well-known case of formula bypass relating to the 2012 Olympics, what other specific cases have there been of difficulties experienced by the devolved governments with the operation or administration of Barnett?
I'm not sure I would necessarily categorise the 2012 Olympics as formula bypass, because part of what was going on with the 2012 Olympics was deciding whether and how the formula applied at all, and deciding it doesn't apply to something is not quite the same as bypassing it, saying it does apply, but we're going to disregard it in this instance. For those, I don't know how familiar members of the committee are with what happened around the 2012 Olympics, but originally the idea, I gather, had been that there were going to be 3 funding streams identified as programmes of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport that would fund the Olympics. One was to fund fund the Team GB and sporting side of what was going to happen around the Olympics. The second was to fund the construction of the facilities at the Olympic Park. And the third was to fund the wider area regeneration. And originally, the idea had been that the first two would be designated as for the benefit of the UK as a whole, and therefore they would not trigger consequential payments under the block grant. But the third would be for the benefit of England only, because obviously regeneration relates very specifically to the area it happened in, and that would trigger a Barnett consequential, and that was by some distance the largest element of the funding. However, when the statement of funding policy was being framed in the wake of the 2007 spending review, the decision was taken to merge these three funding streams into one and to treat the whole stream as being for the benefit of the UK as a whole. And that meant that all the spending on regeneration in Stratford, which was very extensive works, I say, did not trigger Barnett consequentials. So that's the first stage of the argument that broke out there. The second stage was what happened when the devolved administrations got together to object to this. And ultimately, this led to the first meeting of the recently established dispute resolution panel that's been established under the revision to the Memorandum of Understanding between the UK government and devolved administrations that took place in 2010. And essentially, Treasury said no, we made our decision, we're not going to budge. So even though there was a very strong argument that this had taken quite a lot of spending out of devolved government's pockets, that it was completely inappropriate, they exercised all the pressure and made all the strongest argument they could, but they still couldn't persuade the Treasury before the Disputes Resolution Panel, which, for these purposes, was Francis Maude, the Cabinet Office Minister, so a UK government minister who hadn't been involved in the process before. He had no authority to impose a solution. He simply had to accept the conclusion that Treasury took. So effectively, the devolved government's got nowhere with this process, and this is going to remain a problem that's built into this present structure of resolving disputes, particularly finance disputes. To answer your question a little more directly, I mentioned earlier the question of higher education tuition fees and the precedent that this may set, that there's scope for more generally, that there is scope for the UK government, in effect, again, to disapply the Barnett formula by moving headings of spending from being public spending to being private spending. And when you move the burden of spending directly to the citizen and not being borne by tax revenues generally, that effectively takes something outside the Barnett formula as well. And that can lead over time to quite a significant reshaping of public services. Beyond that, there aren't very many direct instances in recent years of Barnett bypass in that sense, but there have been a number of cases where there has been a reformulation or debatable formulation or an argument about the formulation of the statement of funding policy. So, for example, Transport for London was originally in 1999 classed as being for the benefit of the whole of the United Kingdom, and therefore spending on TfL did not trigger consequentials. That was recategorised in the 2003, I think it was, spending review, 2002 or 2001 spending review, which happened to coincide with the point at which there were large amounts of capital spending on tube improvements, originally through not very well structured public-private partnerships. So devolved governments actually got a benefit of that additional spending on local transport in London. Something similar has happened in relation to Crossrail. At the moment, HS2 is classified as being an overall Department for Transport area of spending, and therefore triggers quite a significant consequential as well. It will be interesting to see when there is another spending review whether HS2 is categorised in a different way, because of course only £2 billion or so has been spent on that so far. There will be very substantial spending if the project goes ahead in the next Parliament. And how that is categorised will therefore trigger very significant consequentials potentially for devolved governments.
I think what I'd like to say is the problem is that there is no statutory basis for the Barnett formula, and therefore nothing to stop the Treasury moving the goalposts as and when they see fit. Let me tell you a little story. It's a fairly trivial instance, but it is I think, illuminating. Somebody in Flight 3 was looking at the accounts and found out that Kew Gardens, the botanical gardens in Kew, was regarded as of national significance and therefore was excluded from having a barnet consequential. On the other hand, the National Botanical Garden of Wales, it falls entirely under the cost of the Welsh Government. So they raised the point, why the hell is Kew regarded as of national significance, but the Edinburgh Botanical Garden, the Botanical Garden in Wales is not? This is unfair. For once, the Treasury gave way and included a small consequential expenditure on Kew Gardens. I mean, you can imagine it's very small. And everybody thought, great, a win. He happened to look at the accounts a couple of years later, and it was back out again. You know, so they just put it in and out as they feel like. And there really isn't anything stopping them doing that. There's no independent initial assessment of what consequentials are. I mean, in my opinion, that could be done by the ONS or the OBR or some other body which is nominally independent. And then the Treasury could take the spreadsheet. If they want to override something for political reasons, fair enough. But at least let's know that a political decision is being made. It's not being hidden as a technical thing. So I would think some strategy based for the barnet formula and some sort of appeals mechanism would be appropriate just to keep them honest. At the moment, it's a catch as catch can kind of game.
If I might add a couple of points to that. I'm not. I'd entirely agree with Professor Holtham that there needs to be some independent body that makes a judgment about what ought to trigger consequentials or not. Even if that is then subject to to review by Treasury. I'm not sure that ONS would either welcome or be the appropriate body to deal with that. Perhaps the Auditor General and the National Audit Office might be one better body, though they are, of course, officers. The Controller and Auditor General is an officer of the UK Parliament, so that may raise a slightly different question. The other suggestion is one that Professor Holtham and I have both recommended in varying settings, and that's the idea of some sort of independent finance commission. And it seems, I think both of us would agree that would be an appropriate. The UK both needs that sort of a body, and it would be an appropriate job for that body to do. The second safeguard that I think could be introduced and would be very well worth further consideration is the question of who actually approves the statement of funding policy. At the moment, it is simply a statement of Treasury policy. It's a document issued internally by the Treasury. It's not even formally a command paper. It's not even formally laid before the UK Parliament. It does not have, while there is obviously consultation with devolved governments about it, there is no direct mechanism for devolved governments to endorse or approve it before it takes effect at a spending review. Now, perhaps that's a reflection of the fact that the spending review process is a spending review process within one government, and equally Northern Ireland would not expect that its own budgetary process be subject to that sort of oversight by another government. But nonetheless, there needs to be some further thought. This is a document no longer that it actually is purely that of one government. It is a document effectively of constitutional significance. Now, one suggestion that I know that I've heard made before by the Scottish Finance Secretary, John Swinney, is that devolved finance ministers should be responsible for approving it. At the moment, to the extent there is a political approval on behalf of devolved governments, it comes from the Territorial Secretaries of State, who are, of course, ministers in the UK government, bound by UK collective responsibility. I suspect that the shift to having devolved ministers endorse the detail of that would actually make a significant difference to how it is framed and the process of settling it and agreeing what goes into it.
The question that just pops into my head is, before Barnet was in place, what was there? And did it work at all?
There was something called the Goshen formula, which was named for a 19th century Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, which applied essentially a population proportion of public spending in England to Scotland, Scotland, Wales, and as was Ireland when that was appropriate.
Okay. Members, any other questions?
The thing is very much devolution of functions, and the secretaries of state slowly accumulated more functions in their areas, but at the early stage, expenditure would have been driven by the same geographical formula as are used within England. So, Wales would have been treated like Cornwall or somewhere, would have got whatever the needs-based formula said. With the Secretary of State, that's the first time you get a separate piece, which the spending ministries in England now have to regard differently. So I think one argument for needs-based adjustment to the budget is that simply small position exists before you make this mistake.
Okay, members. Professor Holtham, Professor Trench, thank you both very much. We may follow up on some of those queries in writing as well. Can I say personally, and think other members would agree, that I find this session very fascinating and a good start to your report. Thank you very, very much.
Very pleased for a bit of help.
Thank you.
I never know what he says. How do you find that?
Flexible work.
Shared work was $1,000 more
Is it the Wi-Fi on there?
I don't know if FaceTime is any better.
Yeah.
Yes, on that.
There's difficulties there.
Correspondence, Shane.
Okay, Chair, just quickly run through some items required
They copy
decision.
Wi-Fi both hands.
I just refer members to page 91 of the pack. DFP's writing in relation to a proposed legislative consent motion, which the ETI department will be in the lead on this one, but DFP has been consulted. It's a small business, enterprise and employment bill, assignment of receivables. It's just outlined there that the principal intention is to the assignment of receivables is to make it easier for businesses, particularly small businesses, to raise finance on the strength of their book debts. So it's really just to see at this stage, based on the information provided, if members are generally content with this proposal, so that this committee can alert and notify the ETI committee.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, great.
It's one step short of what the banks do. They just sell their bad debts.
Yep. Then there's correspondence, Chair, at page 96, 97 of the packets from the Historic Royal Palace. It's just providing a written briefing to the committee on its plans in relation to Hillsborough Castle. So it's really just for noting, it's not directly relevant to the department's remit. Then the Consumer Council have issued a press release welcoming the Competition Authority's decision to fully investigate the personal current accounts market. So it's just for noting again, but there will be a briefing from the Consumer Council later in the probably after Christmas recess at this stage, Chair, so it could be raised then. And finally, there's a press article on the reform of defamation laws at page 22 of Table Papers. And it's pointing out that the Northern Ireland Law Commission is to wind up at the end of this financial year, and will have implications in terms of the proposed public consultation on reform of defamation law. So it mentions that the Justice Department and Finance Departments are discussing the best options for the future handling of the review. So just to draw that to members' attention and see if they, if the committee wants to get an update from the department on the options, or in terms of how it's taken forward.
Agreed.
That's all the that's all the correspondence.
All sound enthusiastic.
Okay, members, draft work programme pages 101 to 104. Can advise members as proposed to add some additional items. Considering adding a briefing to next week's agenda on the provisions in the draft budget. for £133 million associated with increased employers' pensions contributions. This will be opportune as responsible officials are before the committee next week on a separate issue. Would members be agreeable to that?
Yep.
Can I seek agreement that similarly the opportunities taken to request that the NI Centre for Economic Policy provides an oral briefing on the impact of the draft budget to the wider economy when it is before the committee on the 26th of November? Agreed. Seek agreement that given the limited time for scrutiny, invites are issued to NICFA, CBA, FSB and the trade unions to respond in writing to the committee on the draft budget to inform the committee's coordinated report. Agreed? I also remind members that the committee has been taking evidence on the NIAO report on sickness absence. The further draft report will be considered at an upcoming meeting. Can I seek agreement that for completeness a written response is sought from trade union side to the report and subsequent evidence received by the committee? Agreed. Any other business? No. Next meeting will be next Wednesday at 10 a.m.
Room 30.
Sorry, Chair.
Yes, one item of extra
No,
business.
just after having that very good, I think it was very informative presentation by Professor Holtham and Trench, even though I couldn't really hear him very well, Professor Holtham. But just, we're having, you know, the review of the operation of the Barnett formula, and we're getting briefings from other witnesses. That's on the 3rd of December. Is it? Or?
Yeah, Chair, the research paper identified potential witnesses, so we can work on scheduling more evidence sessions and based on those suggested.
Yeah, because I you know, there's one or two that I would have suggested, but I mean, I can share it with yourself. I mean, and we can discuss it in committee. And
German and the Australian model.
Yeah, they look particularly attractive.
We need to go. Would we need to go to Australia in January?
I think maybe just, you know, Michael Burke, who's the independent economist, you know, he produced a recently completed research on our local economy here, you know, so if you want to add him to the list as
I think we
well.
should ask Bumper Graham to come.
Yeah, well, there is a trade union economist as well, Paul Flanagan and Evan and stuff.
You want a bit of entertainment.
Him and McCann would do it.
So maybe, I mean, I'll chat to Phil later. And I've got a...
Okay.
Okay.
Meeting over?
There's the Northern Ireland Assembly